I think defense coordination, defense industrial complexes, and how we coordinate them in Europe is exactly one of the major topics which is being discussed in Brussels right now. After all, there is a new defense commissioner for the first time, and joint procurement and similar issues are exactly what he has to figure out over his mandate. Maybe David could enlighten us a bit on how the discussions around that are ongoing, because as James said, there are indeed very different interests in the various EU member states of how much money needs to be put in there. And of course, defense industries are very, very symbolic, very emotional, sovereignty related topic to each of the member states, and indeed also to the UK. And yet, with the defense spending we could achieve so much more if we were able to pool it better and coordinate it better. Please, David.
Yes, thank you, Felix, and thank you, James, for great statement. Indeed, for the first time in the history of the European Commission, we now have a commissioner for defense and space. That is the portfolio of Andrius Kubilius. Mr. Kubilius is a very experienced politician. He was a colleague in the European Parliament the last term, and he was twice Prime Minister of Lithuania. So he knows NATO, he knows the EU, he knows the United Nations. Now, when it comes to security and defense cooperation, we have to be careful not to mix things up. The European Union doesn't have an army. The European Union doesn't have a single tank, fighter plane, or battleship. That is all the responsibility of the member states. And that's why if we talk about strengthening European security and defense cooperation, it's threefold. The first one is bilateral cooperation, trilateral cooperation between individual countries. Here, let's mention the Franco-British Defense Cooperation, or now the new steps forward between Germany and Britain. We have very close German-Dutch defense cooperation, the German-Polish Corps in Czechia. So, I mean, this is what member states are doing among themselves. The second one is the European cooperation within NATO. How can we strengthen the European pillar within NATO? How can we make sure that we have more at an eye level with the United States in NATO, which, by the way, the US spend 64% of all money in NATO, and all the others, including Canada, Turkey, Britain, and the EU-23, who are also in NATO, and we spend 36. That is not sustainable. And the third thing is, what can the European Union do? And here, the area where the European Union can really make a difference is how to better coordinate European defense industry. That is the main task for Mr. Kubilius. How can we step up our production, and how can we make sure that we get more value for the money? Because in the moment, still far too many member states are individually purchasing defense equipment. If we did this together, collectively, we would be spending taxpayers' money more effectively. And of course, when it comes about the future of European security and defense, it will also mean, can we spend as much money as possible in Europe? Because we are going to spend billions of euros and pounds in the next years to step up our defense readiness. Much of this money will be spent in the United States, but the more we can spend in Europe, the better this would be. But as having served the German military myself, I would always argue it's not, in the first case, if something comes from America, Europe, Korea, or somebody else. What we need is the best equipment for our men and women who are serving in our armed forces. And a final point on the EU-UK relations. When we talk about a closer cooperation on foreign and security related issues, What we mean in Europe is that we have a new institutional framework, which includes regular strategic consultations at political level. It means joint working groups between the EU institutions and UK representatives. Also, the UK Prime Minister could be invited on a regular basis to European Council meetings, and the ministers could be also invited to the meetings of their counterparts at a ministerial level. But what we certainly need is a closer cooperation on defense industry. And here we have made some concrete proposals how we believe we could move things forward so we can react better to hybrid threats, cyber attacks, and international conflicts. We're actually waiting now for a concrete British response.
Thank you. James, could you maybe respond to that, how the UK side has perceived those proposals, or how internal discussions maybe in certain ministries or security and defense circles go on about that? Because after all, our audience is a mix between British and continental auditors or people participating. And so it would be quite interested to hear some of the British views on those questions or fundamental points David just raised.
Yeah, yes, of course, Felix. So, I mean, this is an interesting situation, because the general consensus here, at least in London, in the sort of strategic stroke think tank community, is that we don't really fully understand what the UK approach is. The government still has to outline it in a concrete way. At the moment, there is a general consensus that the UK and the EU, and perhaps also others like Norway, should work more closely together. There's a general feeling that is the case. And as we've discussed at the very beginning of this session, the geopolitical and the sort of internal economic and the internal political alignment is in such a way that this now makes sense. But there, of course, are still some differences in terms of how it should take shape. So, there may be EU proposals, and maybe these have been discussed at the the highest political level, including when the Prime Minister was in Brussels. But I don't think they fully filtered down yet into the media and the sort of the media space and the political space here in London. So it will be interesting to see what those proposals actually are. Where there is a great deal of alignment is, I think, on the need for increased, defence spending. But there, the UK side has been a little, how do I put it, unambitious in terms of the amounts that are probably required here. The UK is spending around, I think, 2.3% of its GDP, if you cobble in almost everything, including the aid that has been provided to Ukraine. This is a very, very low level of defense spending still in terms of historical levels. During the Cold War period from 1949 until 1989, the UK was spending something in the region of 6.3 to 6.4%. And the strategic situation as it is now is perhaps as dangerous as it was back then. So we really all need to get or act together here, and we all know that some European countries are spending significantly less than what the UK is now. So it's one thing to say that we can pool our resources, we can perhaps get more punch for the pound or for the euro, but I think there's also got to be more spending more generally as well for this to actually work. So that's one dimension of this. But then also, how do we get over where there have often been in the past various defence industrial interests from certain and particular member states, also including in the past the UK? How do we get past those in such a way that we can all benefit? And then there's another issue here, and that is, how do you factor in outside players? So the UK has a very strong defence industrial relationship with the United States through projects such as the F-35 Joint Combat Aircraft. And it's also now got, through the AUKUS agreement, a strong and growing relationship, both in terms of submarine technologies, but also next generation sciences and technologies which may sit beyond the explicit military sector, but also straddle it within the so-called Pillar 2. How do we create an alignment where those relationships can be both upheld, but also perhaps played back into the European defence and industrial space so that we can all benefit. So there's a number of different, I think, issues that need to be thought about here. And then if I may, there's also another dimension to this, and it needs to be in a way future-proofed. So the political situation in the UK is more settled than it has been in many years. We now have a party in power with a very large majority, but the previous party also had quite a large majority, historically speaking. But that also, was shaken quite profoundly at the last election. And the opinion polls here are looking quite interesting in the sense that a very an even more anti-EU party is pulling forward in the polls. In fact, it's the first time that the Labour Party and the Conservative Party have not been in the lead because of another party called Reform UK, which has come to the fore. What does that mean for the future of the relationship, and how can any agreement that is signed in the coming months be future-proof so that it can't be unpicked or disentangled destructively, as perhaps Brexit was undertaken in the past?
Thank you. Yeah, please, David. Yeah.
A brief comment. I love the way James put it, that we're still waiting for concrete proposals coming from the British side. The tone is definitely positive. We've had some very positive messaging from London. The European Union has been clear that we would like to aim to make meaningful progress with regard to our relationship. It's about developing an agenda based on 3 pillars: peace and security, mobility and citizens' rights, and sustainability. We've made a few proposals, we presented a few ideas. The reaction of the UK government was rather cautious. Okay. Last time I was in London, I was pressed at a press conference, what is my message for the UK government? And in the end, I didn't know to help myself, and I just quoted the Spice Girls. Tell us what you want, what you really, really want. And I think that is a kind of the atmosphere here in Brussels. We want to make this EU-UK summit in May a success, but I think the time has now come that we start working on concrete ideas, what we can actually do.
Thank you. I think this is a perfect quote, because ultimately, from observing the discussions on both sides of the channel, we all seem to be in agreement. We need to spend more. We need to get more for the money we put into defense. We should all have some sort of industrial defense strategies, which ideally work hand in hand, and yet we seem to struggle to come up with new structures, and as James just put it, future-proof structures, because I do agree that these new political parties seem to arise not just in the UK. We also have a similar problem on that in Germany right now, and in about 3 weeks' time, we know the result of the German elections. So it is a volatile world, both geopolitically, but also it seems within our own democracies. And so any structure which we need to create needs indeed to be future-proof. But in order to create those structures, we need to know what one really wants, other than general statements of alignment of ideas, right? And we are the ideas network, so we like to spin ideas, and we have a long-term focus, and the long-term focus should indeed not look at elections and upcoming or lowering parties or new administrations or whatever else, but really look at the structures which can be created if third parties or third countries and EU member states cooperate on something as vital as shared defense and security. Any thoughts on that? This question goes out to both of you. How you could envisage such a future, other than just inviting each other to council meetings, or have defense secretaries who meet at NATO meetings already anyway, and so on and so forth. We need to come up with proper structures where maybe defense is excluded from the single market, in the sense that third parties or friendly states, for example, could participate. in joint procurement or joint development of new defense platforms. Maybe
Okay,
James
well,
first, or David.
Well, Felix, I can be brief here because I already mentioned that the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, which is in place now for 4 years, has a number of structures and they are all up and running. And that is positive. And on the basis of these kind of institutions, we could, as a European Union, imagine also a new institutional framework beyond the, you have described it, existing ad hoc cooperation. It would, in the end, consist of 3 elements. First, regular strategic consultations at political level, as the EU also maintains with other strategic partners such as the US through third country dialogues. Second element, joint working groups between the EU institutions, UK representatives and member states on topics in which cooperation can be further intensified. And third, as I mentioned, the Prime Minister as well as UK ministers could be invited as guests to select parts of European Council and EU Council meetings. So, I mean, we have these kind of structures also for other policy fields. Why shouldn't it be possible to do this on the most important matter of European security and defense? And then, finally, we have already seen where the UK can cooperate more closely. I'll give you one example, how deeper EU-UK defence ties can complement existing European defence frameworks, such as for permanent structured cooperation. The UK has recently rejoined the cooperation, so we have more ways to ensure that our efforts are synergistic and not duplicating existing structures. So the TCA, Felix, is a living agreement. Originally, there was an entire chapter foreseen for security and defense cooperation. It was the British side that then said, no, they're not interested. It's a living agreement. We could add this chapter easily.
Well, I'm aware the British side didn't want to have it in the TCA initially, but James, within the security circles you move around in the UK, is there now a move or a willingness to open up such a new chapter and make this living TCA a bit of a broader one, which includes security and defense?
I mean, you know that at the moment we have a defence review that's underway. That's going to report in the spring, or maybe a little later than that. The deadline or the date is still being determined. That will, I mean, I think shape some of this, but the two are running alongside one another. I mean, as I said at the beginning, I think there is a greater openness now to more cooperation, even coordination between the UK and the EU. But I think, you know, there's a risk here that we get stuck into another sort of bubble. And that is, well, what is this all for? And, you know, the EU has had many defense initiatives going all the way back to the late 1990s with the British and the French kickstarting it with the St. Malo Agreement and then the headline goals of 1999 and then 2003, the battle groups, permanent structured cooperation. You know, the list is almost endless. But you know, we seem to be facing a situation where we have a worsening strategic environment around us that's actually in Europe now, not just in some distant periphery. And we need to have a significant military defense build-up to not only defend our interests surrounding Europe, but also our own security. So, you know, I think there are 3 primary issues here that we need to overcome, and all of this should be there should be some purpose behind it, beyond having it for its own sake or simply to improve the relationship. And, you know, that is firstly, well, how do we help Ukraine win, to prevent Pandora's box from opening, to prevent Russia from thinking that it can get away with doing whatever it likes? How can we compound our deterrence? And this is also when it touches on NATO and also member states, both within NATO and the EU, their own areas of competence. How do we shore up the deterrence of the alliance, of the bloc? And then how do we protect the maritime communication lines that link us to the rest of the world, and on which we're so dependent for international trade, both for the import of manufactured goods, for raw materials, but also for the sale of our products, and beyond that also our cables, our communication lines that connect us to the rest of the world for the, you know, the fourth industrial revolution and the connectivities that brings, the potential prosperity that brings. how do we protect all of these? How do we defend our interests? And, you know, where is the commitment from Britain, from the EU, from the member states of the EU to spend more on defense, to coordinate effectively so that we can actually achieve these objectives in an age where the United States may not be as willing to protect us or to defend our interests, to secure our flank as it was in the past, for the simple reason that it is confronting, you know, a China which has underway a massive naval rearmament program, or even an armament program, that will force it to focus more on the Indo-Pacific, on its western flank, if you will, where it has, you know, many overlapping interests.
Okay, James, understood. I didn't want to overstate the British participation in one of the PESCO projects, in this case, military mobility.
Mm-hmm.
But still, it was an important step forward because it was actually the UK as a member state who blocked over years and years any kind of closer formalized cooperation. And we could only move forward with PESCO actually once the British had decided to leave. So this is just one example. For those who are not absolutely familiar with this, the PESCO project, military mobility, is a project which is about streamlining the movement of military equipment and troops across Europe. But there are other ideas which have been presented by people who are very knowledgeable. The UK could pursue an administrative agreement with the European Defence Agency, similar to the agreements we have in place for Norway, Switzerland, and Ukraine, allowing the UK more consultation, visibility, and involvement in European Defence Agency projects. Or another idea could be that the United Kingdom participates in or works with the European Defence Fund, the EDF, which, as we all know, supports defence research and development. The option of joining the EDF, however, is not possible because it is currently unavailable to third countries. So I absolutely agree. The one thing is to have these formalized structures. The other thing is that we really move things forward. But as James pointed out, when it comes to military cooperation, it's not the EU. It's the member states like France, Germany, and others who have these initiatives already up and running with the UK. Where we can involve the UK is everything around defense industry, purchase, and research of defense equipment. And this is where I think there's really low-hanging fruit. I think most member states are absolutely convinced that this is the right way to include the UK, perhaps with the exception of one country which starts with F, and I'm not talking about Finland.
Thank you very much. This ties actually nicely in with one of the questions from the audience, given that we talk so much about getting more money for our taxpayers' involvement. How can we finance all of this? Because if we go into more defense spending for various reasons which have all been mentioned and are pretty clear, it seems, for at least the security circles, somehow the money has to come from somewhere. And our industrial base has been shrinking, as James mentioned, and in Brussels and in particular in Germany, we also have certain rules of how much debt we can take on as governments or as common debt. Somehow the money needs to be put onto the table, because otherwise this remains a mere technical exercise without resulting in concrete more defense cooperation and spending. How should it be done? Any ideas of both of you, please?
I can be short here because this is the most difficult question of all.
Always.
A number we have heard many times in Europe, here in Brussels, is that the amount of investments which are necessary to get the level of defense security which is required is 500 billion euros. And where this money is going to come from, this is the tiny little issue where we don't have an agreement among member states yet. as you can imagine, and I'm very sure that you will not get any answer on this before the German elections on the 23rd of February. But after the German elections, the new German government will have to give an answer. How can we finance all this? The one thing is that we need to prioritize our national budgets, also the MFF of the European Union. I can think of an increased new role for the European Investment Bank. There are many other things we can do, also how to attract private capital. But this all will not be enough to really stem this huge, huge challenge. And Commissioner Kubilius was asked during the hearings when he said 500 billion euros, well, Mr. Kubilius, how are you going to finance all this? And he said, oh, that's up to the Commissioner for the Budget. So the 27 member states in the EU will need to find a solution. I know how different the views are, especially when it comes to additional debts at EU level. We have the frugals, we have the Mediterraneans, and we have the in-betweens. In the end, as always, France and Germany will have to take the lead and come up with a proposal which the other 25 can follow.
Thank you. James, will you say a few words on the UK? And then afterwards, I would like the two of you to make final statements. Thank you. James.
Yeah, so I mean, here, this is not just an issue for the UK, though. This is an issue for all European countries, both EU members and non-EU members. And some EU members, Poland, the Baltic states, have really, amplified or ramped up their defence spending over the last 5 to 10 years, and they've done so quite quickly and from a very low starting base. If you look at Lithuania, I think Latvia, and even Poland, they were spending significantly less than 2%, the agreed amount in 2014 at the NATO summit in the past, and now they're spending in excess of 3%, which is still historically low by the standards of the past. So I mean, there needs to be this is a political issue. I mean, we often hear that it's a financial issue. No, it's not. It's a political issue. It's a political issue on what we spend certain allocations of our national income on. And it requires, I think, something of sort of intellectual leadership here to explain to the European people, to British people, that the environment is such that we have to spend more on defence and we have to spend it as efficiently as possible. The two are not mutually exclusive. And also that defence spending and economic growth are not also mutually exclusive. Remember that when we had very high levels of defence spending in the past, in the latter phase of the Cold War, from the 1950s through to the 80s, the levels of growth that some of our economies achieved, West Germany, France, Britain, they were extremely high. They were above 3%, even 4%. So the two are not necessarily one doesn't lead to the other being less, so to speak. So I think there needs to be an intellectual push from politicians, from the sort of academic and think tank communities, to explain why this is needed. And then ultimately, it is going to be, I think, an issue, at least to get the spending initially, it's going to be an issue of releasing or relaxing debt breaks so that we can generate the surge that's needed before and while there's a gradual reallocation of spending from other areas into defence, and that in the longer run, that this will actually stimulate economic growth across the continent and lead potentially to new scientific and technological breakthroughs, as it has in the past.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, James. And then I give final words to David before I wrap up our seminar.
Okay, my final words will be a quote I found a couple of days ago, which still fascinates me. This is something the greatest chancellor in German history said, Konrad Adenauer, on the 3rd of April at an event in Munich in 1950. 1950, so 75 years ago, Chancellor Adenauer said, I quote, "What does Europe live on? It lives on the mercy of the United States. This will not always remain the case. One day the moment will come and must come when this Europe can help itself again and must stand on its own 2 feet. Now, we stand on our own 2 feet, and we have enjoyed such a close transatlantic cooperation with the United States, and I sincerely hope that we can remain transatlantic, but we will need to become more European in the next years. We need to make Europe more competitive. We need a clear focus on the economy, and we will have to do more for our own security and defense. We need a fair burden sharing in the NATO alliance. And I sincerely hope whatever we do as in the European Union, that we have the closest possible cooperation with our British friends, partners, and allies.
Thank you very much, both, and in particular, David, for this wonderful quote to end. I think there is no better way to end this debate on this quote by Konrad Adenauer. And after having worked for 12 years for the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, I'm particularly fond of that politician. So thank you very much, David, for ending on that actually sobering and very good wrapping up and quote. And thank you very much to James from the Council on Geostrategy for this cooperation and the very fascinating debate we had with the two of you. Thank you very much. And thank you to the audience for tuning in. And I look forward to our next debates. Thank you very much.